Hi, everybody! Meeting Toan again felt like a miracle Tu Diem had once stopped praying for. The joy of seeing him, hearing his voice, and standing so close to the man she never truly forgot filled her heart with warmth and tears at the same time. For a brief moment, it seemed as if fate had finally shown her mercy. But joy was only the beginning. Keeping Toan around became her real challenge. With his memories broken and his world unfamiliar, every day tested her patience, her strength, and her love. Tu Diem learned that reunion does not always mean relief. Sometimes it is the start of the hardest journey of all. Because love is not proven in the moment of return. It is proven in the choice to stay. Some reunions arrive like sunlight after endless rain. They warm the heart instantly, but leave the soul trembling. When Tu Diem finally saw Toan again, standing there in plain clothes, thinner than before, his eyes calm yet unfamiliar, her first feeling was joy, a joy so sharp it almost hurt. For days, for nights, she had imagined this moment, how he would look, how he would call her name, how everything broken would suddenly return to the way it once was. But reality was quieter and far more fragile. Toan looked at her the way one looks at a stranger who feels oddly familiar. There was no recognition, no rush of emotion, only polite confusion. Yet even that was enough to make Tu Diem's heart race. Because he was alive, because he was here, because fate had finally stopped running from her. Life did not pause for their reunion. The village still woke early, smoke curled from kitchens, chickens scratched the dirt. People talked about harvests, sore backs, and rising prices, small things that somehow made everything feel painfully real. Tu Diem realized then that love did not return in dramatic moments. It returned quietly, disguised as everyday life. Keeping Toan around, she soon understood, would not be easy. He was gentle, helpful, and distant all at once. He thanked her often, spoke carefully, and avoided her eyes when emotions grew too close. Some nights he sat alone outside, staring at the dark fields, as if searching for something just beyond reach. Tu Diem watched from a distance, afraid that if she stepped too close, he would disappear again, this time by choice. The hardest part was pretending not to hurt. She learned to speak less about the past and more about the present, about meals, weather, chores, and rest. She smiled when he laughed, even though that laughter no longer belonged to her alone. Love, she realized, was no longer about being remembered, it was about being patient. Sometimes, when she handed him a cup of tea or called his name softly, Toan would pause, just for a second. His fingers would tighten, his brow would crease, and something unseen would stir behind his eyes. Those moments gave Tu Diem hope, and fear in equal measure. Because meeting Toan again was a gift, but keeping him meant learning how to love someone who no longer knew why he once loved her back, and that, Tu Diem knew, would be the greatest test of her heart. Morning arrived softly, as it always did. The sound of a broom brushing the yard, the clink of bowls in the kitchen, the distant call of a neighbor asking about the weather. Life continued, unaware that Tu Diem's heart was holding its breath. Toan awoke early that day. He folded the blanket carefully, as if he were a guest afraid of taking up too much space. That small gesture pierced Tu Diem more deeply than words ever could. Once, this place had been his home. Once, she had been the one he reached for without thinking. Now, everything required effort. She told herself to stay calm, to let things flow naturally. But love does not know how to be still. It watches, it waits, and it fears. Every time Toan stepped outside alone, Tu Diem felt the old panic rise. What if he doesn't come back? What if today is the day he remembers another life, another path, and chooses to walk away from her again? Toan, too, was struggling in his own quiet way. He sensed the weight of her care, the careful warmth in her voice, the unspoken expectations floating between them. He wanted to be grateful, wanted to respond in kind, but something invisible held him back. His heart felt pulled in two directions, toward the comfort of the present and toward a past he could not see. They shared small moments, cooking together, sitting side by side in silence, laughing at stories that were not theirs. These moments were gentle, almost tender, yet fragile enough to break with a single question neither dared to ask. One afternoon, as they rested after a long day, Toan spoke softly. "If one day I remember everything," he said, not looking at her, "what if I become someone you don't recognize anymore?" Tu Diem's chest tightened. She wanted to tell him that she would recognize him anywhere, in any life, but instead she answered with honesty. "Then we'll learn again," she said, "just like now." That night, Tu Diem lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the creak of wood, the rhythm of breathing nearby. Love, she realized, was no longer about holding on tightly. It was about giving space, even when it hurt, about choosing to stay, even when the other person might not. Keeping Toan around was not a promise she could demand. It was a choice she had to make every day. And so, quietly, without applause or certainty, Tu Diem chose him again, knowing that love's greatest courage is loving without guarantees. Sometimes memories do not return like a storm. They come like a whisper, so quiet that only the heart hears it first. That afternoon, the village was unusually calm. The sun rested gently on the rooftops, and the air smelled of rice and dust. Tu Diem was sorting vegetables in the yard when she noticed Toan standing still near the old well. His hand rested on the rough stone, his eyes distant, as if he had been pulled into another time. "This place feels familiar," he said slowly. Tu Diem froze. She did not rush to him. She had learned that some doors should be opened gently, or not at all. "Maybe you've been here longer than you think," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. Toan nodded, confused by his own emotions. Certain sounds unsettled him. The splash of water, the creak of the bucket, the laughter of children passing by. They stirred something deep inside him, something that refused to take shape. With every flicker of recognition came a dull ache in his head, followed by fear. That night, Toan dreamed. He saw a woman running barefoot through wet grass, calling his name. He felt warmth, urgency, love. But when he tried to see her face, everything blurred. He woke up breathless, his shirt damp with sweat, his heart racing as if he had truly been about to lose something precious. Tu Diem heard him stir and came quietly to his side. She did not ask what he had seen. Instead, she handed him a glass of water, her fingers brushing his. The moment their skin touched, a sharp pain pierced his head, and then a single image flashed before him. Tu Diem, crying, holding his hand. He pulled away, frightened. "Why does being near you make my head hurt?" he asked. "Because maybe your heart remembers faster than your mind," she answered gently. From that moment on, everything felt different. Toan began noticing small things, the way Tu Diem knew his habits, the way she instinctively saved the best food for him, the way her silence spoke louder than questions. These were not things a stranger would know. Still, he resisted. Fear wrapped tightly around him. What if remembering meant losing the peace he had found? What if the past carried pain he was not ready to face? Tu Diem watched him struggle, understanding more than he realized. Loving him now meant standing on the edge of hope and restraint. Pushing could break him, waiting could break her. Yet every night, as they shared the same quiet space, one truth grew clearer. The past was knocking, and neither of them could ignore it forever. Some choices are loud, made in moments of certainty. Others are quiet, made in the fragile space between fear and hope. The morning Toan decided to leave, the house felt unusually still. Tu Diem noticed it in the smallest details: the untouched cup of tea, the bag folded neatly by the door, the way sunlight fell across an empty chair. He hadn't said goodbye yet, but she already felt the weight of his absence pressing against her chest. "I think I need to go," Toan finally said, his voice low. "Not to run away, but to understand who I am." Tu Diem nodded. Her heart screamed, but her lips remained calm. "I know," she replied. Loving him meant not tying him down with fear. They walked together along the familiar dirt path. Around them, life went on as always. Neighbors greeting one another, fields waiting to be tended, children chasing a ball across the road. Ordinary scenes, yet each step felt heavy, as if every moment could be their last. At the edge of the village, Toan stopped. "I don't remember our past," he admitted, "but I remember how you look at me. And I know one thing: I don't want to be a stranger to you." Tu Diem swallowed hard. "Then don't be," she said. "Stay. Not because of memory, because of choice." Silence stretched between them. The wind stirred the trees. Somewhere, a radio played an old love song, thin and distant. Toan closed his eyes. Images flooded his mind. Hands intertwined, shared laughter, tears shed in the dark. Not clear memories, but emotions too real to deny. He reached for her hand. "I may forget again," he said. "I may get lost." "I'll still be here," Tu Diem answered, "not waiting for who you were, but walking with who you are." That was the moment he understood. Love was not about recovering the past, it was about building something new from what remained. He didn't need all his memories to stay, he only needed courage. Toan dropped his bag. They walked back together, slower this time, their steps uneven but aligned. No promises were made, no future guaranteed. Yet, in that simple act, turning back together, they chose each other again. And sometimes, that choice is stronger than memory itself.